for people who aren't very familiar with other kinds of Bible stories, this is one they tend to know. And so if I asked you this morning, no cheating 8:30 people who showed up back again, if I asked you this morning who this story was about, what would you say? I'm sorry? Saul. Oh, you were listening. Okay, good. You were listening. Saul, yes, this story is about Saul, a guy named Saul who then became a guy named Paul. That's another story. But in keeping with this sermon title, surprise, I don't want to talk about Saul. This sermon this morning is not about Saul. Because I have a hard time relating to Saul and to his story. Now, maybe some of you have had a blinding light conversion experience, but I never have. I've never had this big one moment where my whole life was changed in an instant. For many of us, our experience, our walk of faith is a little different. And so I, at least, resonate more with Ananias in this story. Now, some of you are sitting there perhaps wondering, who is this Ananias person and why have I never heard about him? Well, you see, Ananias is sort of like any other guy in a Tom Hanks movie, right? So if Tom Hanks is in a movie, it's a Tom Hanks movie, and then there's, oh yeah, that other guy that was in the Tom Hanks movie. So this is Saul's story, and Ananias is the other guy. And he's the other guy that I want us to know more about because he has a lot to teach us. Now, I know this was a long, long scripture. Elaine read 19 verses. So let's go back and look at it again, because maybe when you got to a verse 10, when Ananias comes into the story, maybe you were thinking about your lunch plans. So let's go back and look at it again. So there is this guy named Saul, and he's going to this city called Damascus to hunt up some of these Jesus-loving people and arrest them. And on his way, he got blinded by this big light and was blind for 3 days. And 3 days in to this altered Damascus trip, God shows up and knocks on the door of this guy named Ananias. And Ananias, he's just one of these Jesus-loving guys just going about doing his business when God shows up. And you can imagine Ananias' surprise when God says to him, hey, Ananias, you know that guy who totally disagrees with everything you believe in? That guy who's coming to arrest you and your friends and haul them back to Jerusalem? Yeah, so that guy, I want you to go see that guy and give him a little help. So it's really no surprise that Ananias says, seriously, God? You want me to do what? That's probably a better answer than I would have given God. But Ananias, after a little bit, says, okay, I'll get going. So he goes to see Saul, lays his hands on Saul, gives him back his sight. Saul gets baptized, gets a little lunch, and goes on to be the greatest preacher of the gospel since Jesus himself. Ananias, on the other hand, goes back to being a regular guy whose story nobody really knows much about. And here's why I connect with Ananias. Because this Jesus-loving guy is just going along and doing his thing. And out of nowhere, God shows up and says, surprise! I got this thing you need to do. And that happens to all of us, I think. All of us, God shows up and says, surprise! We're just going along and doing our thing. And God goes, and sometimes we try to ignore God. Nobody's home. Right? I see you nodding, yeah. Sometimes we try to argue our way through God. God thinks that's funny, right? And because God is God, God often wins, but not always. Sometimes God lets us say no and figures out the consequences. But because God is God, oftentimes God wins. A personal example. Ryan and I are just going along about 5 years ago, and we're doing our Jesus-loving thing, and God shows up in the form of a voicemail from a guy named Scott Colglazier in Los Angeles, California, and says, hey, I got these ministry jobs out here. Want to come and see about LA? No. Actually, we laughed, because that tends to be what we do when God shows up and knocks on our door and we get surprised. We laugh. It's a natural response. And so we listened to the message again, and we laughed again. And we said, people like us don't live in LA. We're not moving to LA. We're normal Midwestern people, for heaven's sakes. We're not going to work with those crazy nuts and fruits in Southern California. Those people. Just like Ananias, we said, seriously, God? You want us to do what? And like Ananias, God won. Surprise. God does this kind of stuff. Has it ever happened to you? When God shows up and surprised you, you get this harebrained idea about something that you can't quite figure out where it's coming from. You got this something that keeps you up in the middle of the night. This thing that keeps coming back up in your 5 minutes of quiet time that you're practicing regularly, right? In the summer of 2002, I had convinced a church member of ours at First Christian Church Fort Worth to go to church camp, to counsel church camp. And one day she pulled me aside and she said, Shanna, I've been thinking about something. Now, Sharon had a really great corporate job. She was one of those HR computer trainer people. And she was just going along, doing her thing, and then she had this idea that was keeping her awake in the middle of the night. And she said, I got this crazy idea I need to talk to you about. She said, we have these 6 computers in a classroom at church, and I want to use them to bring in women from the domestic violence shelter just up the street from us and do computer skills training with them. She said, this is the perfect opportunity for them to get into the workforce and have some opportunities that will benefit them and their kids. And this crazy idea began to significantly change the focus, not only for Sharon, but for that entire congregation. Sharon said yes to beginning to think more about how this crazy idea might unfold. And then crazy other things started to happen. One morning, a church member, called the church office. They'd bought a new laptop, and they said, hey, we have this old, antiquated desktop. We were wondering if the church could use it. Well, maybe, I don't know. We'll call you back. Fast forward about 4 hours to Sharon calling. So we have a problem. We have 7 women who've applied. We only had 6 computers, remember? We've got 7 women who've applied. Surprise, we have 7 computers. Things began to roll. Our high school kids worked and played with the women's children, helped them with their math homework. The ladies of the church began fixing a meal for these women and their families before their class each evening. A closet that was full of stuff for Lord knows how long got cleaned out. Stuff got thrown away. because we realized these women were going to graduate and get jobs, and they needed some business-attired clothes. So women like me brought stuff they'd grown out of so that somebody else could use that, and we filled that closet. The official Mary Kay lady of the church joined with the official Avon lady of the church, and they gave makeovers to these women to help them build their self-confidence once again. This crazy harebrained idea opened up so many surprising things because Sharon started listening. By the third year of that ministry, 36 women and their 66 children were being trained. Multiple locations by that point. Sharon had to quit her corporate job. And now, 13 years later, that little harebrained idea that involves 6 computers in a Sunday school room has grown into a full nonprofit with an annual budget of hundreds of thousands of dollars. Surprise! God will surprise us in ways we can't even begin to imagine if we open ourselves up. Well, I can't have a sermon this week without some reference to Pope Francis, now can I? Now be careful, I haven't said anything yet. You may not clap when I'm done. Now there's a lot that I could talk about with Pope Francis this week, but here's what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the Pope riding around all over the country in a little black Fiat. You're laughing. I laughed. I laughed this week at the Pope riding around. Dignified world leaders don't ride around in a little black Fiat, for heaven's sakes. They ride around in black limousine tanks, except for Francis. And I laughed at Francis in his little black Fiat until I heard a story on NPR this week. And the story, like all of you, started out by laughing at Pope Francis in his little black Fiat. And one of his friends said it even looks like a clown car with all of those guys trying to pile into it. And then a friend of Francis, a longtime friend of Francis, explained how that little black Fiat is the perfect metaphor for Francis's message. See, he explained about the word fiat and the prominent position that word plays in the Gospel of Luke. Gospel of Luke, fiat. I thought, they had my attention. And according to the NPR story, you have to read Luke in Latin, which I can't do. But in there, Mary uses this fiat word to respond to the angel Gabriel when Gabriel comes to tell her she's pregnant with the Christ child. In Latin, fiat roughly translates, "let it be done." And the Pope's friend tried to explain it this way, quote, "I think for the Pope, fiat is what he's trying to do with his life, trying to do the will of God all the time." Fiat. Google translates it, "so be it." Or perhaps the way we've been saying it lately, "may it be so." And I've been thinking about this for several days now, laughing at Francis and his fiat, in part because of surprise, because that's what we do when we're surprised. But Francis is driving through life in a fiat, the way he always has in his simple way, just trying to do what God asks today. This quiet, humble, simple man who has surprised the world. He's not flashy or exciting. He speaks softly, and he's just going about doing his Jesus-loving thing after surprising thing, a life in a fiat. And I envision Francis, like Ananias, who just wants to be a regular guy. He doesn't wear the red shoes. You can't be the Pope without wearing the red shoes, people said. Francis said, I can be the Pope without wearing red shoes. Because God's got stuff for me to do. I need my comfy shoes. And some of those things, I imagine Francis saying, really, God? Seriously? You want me to do what? Like be the Pope? And then eventually, he gets to saying fiat. And I think the Pope is challenging us to do the same, to ride through our life together in a fiat, going to people that we may not want to go and help, Ananias, not focusing on flashing lights or high-profile lunches with legislators, but having lunch with the high-profile homeless people of their city. He's making people uncomfortable with what he sees as God's priorities, focusing people in a new way, encouraging them to get into his clown car of a fiat, because God just might be in it. Now, what does this mean for you and for me and for our collective life together? Well, I have to tell you, last Tuesday night, our leadership worked really hard here at Community Christian Church, examining our priorities and what's next for us together. And I have to tell you, I think God is going to have some surprises for us. And I wish I knew what they were. I really, really wish I did. But we have to be ready together. When you come to me to share with me this thing that is keeping you up in the middle of the night, and when I come to you asking you to consider, to pray about something, and you think I have lost my ever-loving mind. And when it happens, and when we laugh together, we may even argue with God, or even trying to ignore God at work, we have to stop and remember that maybe we just need to say, fiat. Those are our fiat moments. Those are our moments when we have to remember that hopefully we have all climbed together into this little black clown car of a fiat and have committed to just trying to do every day what God is calling us to do next. And fiat moments can be hard, and they can be really uncomfortable, and they may realign our priorities, may challenge us to welcome new people or to go and help people we aren't really excited about helping. But we can be assured that the saints of our scripture show us, that the saints of our modern day show us, that when God surprises us, if we will recognize it as a fiat moment, God will use us to do some pretty amazing and surprising things. May it be so. Fiat.